right, so we're going to talk about now the English Reformation. Now, the English Reformation was very, very different from the Martin Luther Reformation, only because it was Henry VIII throwing a big old tantrum. So let's talk about it real quick, and I'm just going to kind of get off of there for a minute so you're not reading ahead. So let's talk about what was going on. This is 15 mid 1500s at the very latest. Let's see, 1530s anyway. And so I mean we're talking about Martin Luther doing his stuff about the same time. So I mean, we're talking about all of this going on in the same time that everything's happening over in Europe. And so, Henry VIII is king of England. And Henry VIII may be a lot of things. And if you know the name Henry VIII, you think about Henry VIII being this big old fat dude. And he was. But he wasn't always this big old fat dude. He was very handsome when he was younger, very tall. He was like 6'3". And tall, 6'3" was tall back then. Most men, and that's one of the things we'll talk about, and you'll forget it, and we'll talk about it again, and you'll forget it, and we'll talk about it again. When we get to Napoleon, everybody would say, yeah, he was that short dude. For this time period, he was short. But back then, men were not tall, and a lot of it had to do with people's diet, especially rich people did not believe in eating vegetables. That was for the poor people. Poor people had to eat vegetables. So they ate mostly bread and meat. And so they had absolutely no vegetables in their diet. And so they did not grow much. And they got things called scurvy, which is what you get when you don't have fruit and vegetables in your diet. And so people didn't live very long. Number one, your life projections and that really didn't have a whole lot to do. Well, yeah, I mean, it had a lot to do with what you ate, not necessarily vegetables, but it did have a lot to do with how tall you got. Now, yes and no, but anyway, Henry VIII was tall and he was very handsome and he had red hair, and just very, very, very nice looking young man. But he was not in line for the throne. Now let's talk about this for just a second. And do I have drawing tools on here? I don't know if I do or not. Let me see if I can go back to my screen. Give me just a second. If I can go back to my screencastify here for a second. May not have the option of being able to draw in here. And my whiteboard's over there. So I will do this. I will grab a marker and just a piece of paper. How about that? So, if you have a king and a queen, head of a country, and your children, your children Okay. If this is how, and this may be backwards for you, but if you have a boy, boy, and girl, then the first boy will be then the first one in line for the throne. And then if something happened to that son, then the next son would be in line for the throne. And then the next son, and then the girl, if no other children came about. Now, if all your children died, then it would fall to the brother of the king. Okay. But then if the brother had died, then it would fall to the brother's children and so forth and so on. And that's why sometimes it would go to cousins and so forth. Okay. So let's say then you have a king and a queen. And this is your children. You have girl, 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 boy, boy. Okay. Well, until the year 2013 in England, none of these girls would rule first. That first boy would rule as king. Okay. So none of these girls would be queen over that first brother. So it was very, very important to a king that you have a son and that you have a healthy son that could be king. Because otherwise, why am I marrying you? Why am I marrying a woman unless I'm marrying a woman to give me a son? That's all you're there for. You know, we don't, at this point in the 1500s, we don't know about biology. We don't know that the man is the one who gives us the sex of the child. So it's, you know, up to the woman and up to the woman only. Now, here's another little thing. And again, you'll know me. I within bounds of getting in trouble, I tell you how it is and I tell you the truth and I skirt around issues. But I, you know, tell you the truth on things. The king can have as many mistresses as the king wants to have, and it's not against the law. And the king can have as many illegitimate children as he wants to have, and it's not against the law. Now, illegitimate in those days means entirely something different than it means today. And today, it means the same in terms of what the definition means. It means not married to the parent, to the mother or father of the child. And today, we see absolutely nothing to be anything concerned with because, you know, we just know that, you know, parents are parents. But back then, it was a big deal because it went against the teachings of the church. The teachings of the church said that mothers and fathers, you know, were married when you had a child. And so you just didn't let it be known that you had an illegitimate child. Well, on top of that, you know, for women, it was worse than men. Double standard, I know, but women, it was worse than men. Most men always had illegitimate children, and it was known and it was accepted, and you just shut up about it, especially kings. Now, Henry had multiple illegitimate children, several sons, but the sons could not rule as king. You had to have a legitimate line to the throne, meaning he had to have been married to the mother at the time of the birth. Okay? So, setting up a stage. Now, Henry wasn't even supposed to be king. His older brother was actually the king, supposed to be king of England. All right, and this is where we'll start. Now, Henry had 6 wives. The first wife was Catherine of Aragon. And there's a little saying, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That's how you remember his wives. So his first wife was Catherine of Aragon. He divorced her. Now, she is the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. You will know those names because we will talk about them when we talk about Christopher Columbus. She's the daughter of the people who will fund Christopher Columbus's trip to America. Okay? Now, she had first married the elder son of England, Arthur, who died 5 months into the marriage. So Arthur was supposed to have been king of England, and they were both 15, 16 when they married. Arthur was not well, and it was a arranged marriage when they were young, and it was arranged to strengthen those ties between England and Spain. So when both Catherine and Arthur were born, Isabella and Ferdinand and Henry and Margaret, who were the parents, got together, said, we will marry our children to strengthen those ties. Well, Isabella and Ferdinand were not real happy with Henry VII and Margaret because they were like, Arthur was sickly when you married our daughter, and he died young. And like, what are you going to do about it? Because we gave you a lot of money. Remember the dowry in the last chapter? Well, they had paid them a huge amount of money. A huge dowry was paid to the king of England. Arthur was not king yet. Henry VII was still king, but they had paid them a huge amount of money. Well, the royal family was in a pretty bad situation because they had spent the money and they really didn't know what to do. So Catherine at this point had kind of set her sights on Henry VIII, or Henry at this point. She didn't know he was going to be the 8th yet. She had set her sights on Henry. Arthur was sickly. He was pale. He was thin. And Henry just was tall, and he was slim, and he was athletic, and he was just robust and healthy, you know. And Catherine was like, yeah, I wouldn't mind marrying him. Henry was a little younger, not much. I think he might have even been the same. No, he wasn't the same age as her, but he was a little younger, not much. But the royal family kind of just was like, I don't know. I don't know if we're going to allow you to marry him or not. And the Spanish family was just kind of like, remember the money we gave you? Remember the money we gave you? So anyway, finally, 8 years later, when she was 24, they finally allowed her to marry the second son to continue the royal ties with Spain. Okay, well, the problem is, and they stay married for like 20 years, and from all reports, they're really happy. I mean, they don't not love one another. I mean, and yes, he has mistresses, and I know this is going to sound so bad for me to say, and I don't mean this like to be ugly. They're married for 20 years. He doesn't not love her. And then yes, he has mistresses, but he's not unhappy with her. That's just how it was back in this time. He was expected to have mistresses. And I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying that's how it was. But in those 20 years, she'd only been able to give him one living daughter named Mary. Now, I'm going to back off and say both Catherine and Mary were very, very religious. And when I say they were very religious, they were Catholic. The Spanish are Catholic families. They have ties to the Pope by family. They were related by family to the Pope. And when I say they're very religious, I'm talking they pray for hours at a time. And Henry's religious, but he's not that religious. So he goes to the Pope and he says, listen, I'm not getting any younger and I need a son. And I need to annul my marriage. I don't want to divorce her. Divorce would create a scandal. It would cause her to have a bad name. I just want to annul it. I want to mean that it goes away completely. Well, typically, in the eyes of the church, if there's not a child involved, annulling would be better. It would seem as the divorce would never happen. In the eyes of the church, it only usually grants divorces on the basis of an adultery or abuse. But in this case, if they annulled the marriage, Catherine's daughter would now be considered illegitimate, and she would no longer be in line to be the Queen of England. Well, the Pope, who was related to Catherine's mother and father, says, that ain't happening. So he's about to create huge enemies with Spain if he continues. Okay, so he's about to create a huge problem if he continues with this. So, already he's creating issues with the Pope and now with Spain because he's going to the church. He's already alerted the church and he says, I'm either divorcing Catherine or I'm annulling the marriage, one of the two. Okay, so the Pope said, no, that's not happening. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, you're not doing that. Well, Henry had already found him a new little young tart who said, but Henry, I'll give you a son if you marry me. So Henry went to his spiritual advisors and he went to his political advisors and he said, fix it, fix the problem. So the English courts and the spiritual advisors got together and they formally separated England from the Catholic Church. And they created the Church of England with then the king or the queen, whoever's in power, as the head of the church. So the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. And then they said, well, now we have the Church of England and the king or the queen is the head of that church. And they called it the Act of Supremacy, 1534. And they said, now we have the Church of England. And it's also called the Anglican Church. Okay. Anglo-Saxon, Anglican Church, Church of England, same thing. And so then the Church of England ruled the marriage to Catherine, null and void, divorced, so that Henry could marry sweet little Anne Boleyn. Barely. Well, Anne Boleyn, wife number 2, will give him a daughter named Elizabeth, the ugliest child ever born. She is pale as that piece of paper, red-headed as that cow, and ugly. Well, after not many years, but several years of marriage, she is unable to have any other living children. And Henry has already moved on. But the problem is he has now 2 living wives. He can't divorce Anne because he already has another divorced wife. And the Pope is still mad. And the Pope is still trying to fight all of this, removing them from the church. And if he divorces Anne, they could try to, pull them back in and he could be made to remarry Catherine. Well, Catherine dies in 1536 and and it really don't end up mattering because Catherine dies in early 1536, but they've already brought charges against Anne Boleyn of rumor of incest and adultery against Anne, and that's already been in process. So she's tried and convicted, and she's beheaded on May 13th of 1936. So he already, boom, he's got two wives gone. But Catherine of natural causes. All right, so he marries his new wife, number 3, Jane Seymour, just like 2 weeks later, May 30th of 1936. Jane will give birth to Henry's only legitimate son. Now, I say legitimate because I want to stop here. This is where I stop and say Henry had a son, legitimate, that he recognized. Now, legitimate and recognized is different, but it still doesn't make him legal. Like he still couldn't rule. The legitimate son was named Henry Fitzroy. And so if you ever see the name Fitz anywhere, Fitz, not today, obviously, but back then, Fitz meant illegitimate but recognized. So, like a king or a duke or someone very, very wealthy, they recognized that illegitimate child and gave them, like, couldn't give them a title, but gave them land and money. And then that name passed down then to others within that, family name. And then later on, somebody might have got a title. But Fitzgibbons, Fitzsimmons, Fitzgerald's, Fitz, a long time ago, meant illegitimate but recognized. But Henry's only legitimate living son, Edward, was born to Jane. And Jane will die several days later from blood poisoning. Actually, she died from like doctors not washing their hands and like attending her after she gave birth and nastiness and stuff like that. So Edward VI will grow up, but only to his teenage years. He will rule for a short time over his sisters. Remember, he's third born, but he's the first male. So he will rule before Mary and Elizabeth, but he will die at age 16. Well, Henry cannot go for very long without having a wife. He has to have a wife because he's Henry VIII. By this time, he's like in his 40s, 50s, and he is very, very fat by this time. He has had like in his teens and in his early 20s, he had been hurt playing tennis. And yes, they did have tennis. There is tennis courts actually at Hampton Court, I believe. If you ever go to England and go to Hampton Court, there are preserved tennis courts that he played on. And it's tennis similar to how we play. He had been hurt playing tennis, and then he got hurt in a battle when a horse fell on him. And so he had never fully recovered from either one of those. And so he had, all he could do was sit around and eat. And oh my God, did he eat? And so by the time wife number 4 comes around, he is grotesquely fat. I mean, like hugely fat. And he is, this leg will not heal. Now, one of the reasons why this leg won't heal, and this is where I get really plain with you guys, is he had a sexually transmitted disease from all the women he slept with. He had syphilis. And syphilis, now you can cure syphilis with a good old dose of penicillin. Back then, you really couldn't cure syphilis, and he refused to not sleep with women. So, yeah, he was sleeping around. And here's the other thing is when you have syphilis, you can transmit that to not only your partners, but also to unborn babies. So, yeah, I mean, like, there's a reason why a lot of these women were not having babies and were having trouble having babies, because when you transmit that to your partners, they're not going to be able to have babies and have trouble having living babies. And then the babies that they do have may have mental problems, or may have, sickness. So, like, there's a reason why we have a lot of issues with these kings and queens back then. I wonder why. But anyway, we get to wife number 4, Anne of Cleves. She's my favorite. She is a German Protestant princess. Now, I want to stop here and say Henry never really stopped being Catholic. He was Protestant, like in public, Catholic in private. And I'll talk about that at the end more. But he needed to strengthen the fact that England appeared to be Protestant. So he needed to strengthen those Protestant ties. So he agreed to a marriage with a German Protestant princess named Anne of Cleves. Now, they did not see each other before the marriage. And a very famous artist painted her portrait. And let's just say he painted it he painted her in a very good light, and she didn't exactly look like her portrait. So she got to the castle, and she didn't quite look like her portrait, and he called her a horse. He called her the Flanders mare. And she was like, well, you big fat slob, you don't look quite like you looked in your portrait either. And so they agreed to divorce, but then they realized that they actually kind of liked one another as friends. And he liked her, he just didn't want to marry her. So she agreed to stay on as an advisor. And he said, well, I kind of like you as my sister, and you have good advice. Will you stay on? And she agreed. And so she had a place to live for the rest of her life, and she stayed on and helped him, advise him, and she helped with his finances and helped with the children, and gave advice to them for her entire life. So we're at divorced, beheaded, died, and then divorced. Okay. Now, poor little Catherine Howard. She, I feel sorriest for her. Uh, Henry is pretty much bedbound by now. He also knows that Edward is not well. He knows Edward will not live into his 30s and 40s, so he wants another son. And he marries Catherine Howard. Now, Catherine is 17 to 19. And the reason we're not real sure, like, we didn't keep records as accurately as we do now in terms of birth dates. So we're not exactly sure exactly how old she was, but around 17 to 19. He's 49. Now, she is beautiful, beautiful woman. And here he is, this, like, think of, if you're a Star Wars fan, like Jabba the Hutt laying there in his bed, like this big old blob. And she's expected to go and have a baby with him. And she's like, you know, so she will cheat on him quite openly with her cousin, a man by the name of Thomas Culpeper, and is caught. And, like, that's treason. I mean, like, you do not cheat on the king. The king can cheat on you as many times as you want to, but you do not cheat on the king. Or if you do, you don't do it where people can see it. And so she does. And so she loses her head. Catherine Parr is the last one. She is, by all accounts, the nicest of the stepmothers. She takes care of Elizabeth and Mary as best she can, and is loved by Elizabeth, I know. She dies before Henry does. I'm sorry, Henry dies before she does. And so she survives Henry, but then she will die some years later in childbirth. So we have divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Six wives, the six wives of Henry VIII. There's a really good documentary out there by Lucy Worsley that talks about the six wives of Henry VIII. All right, so England after Henry, and this is where I'll talk about the Catholic behind the walls, so to speak. Edward will rule briefly as a Protestant king. Again, he's only 15 when he dies. When he does die, his older sister Mary will rule as Queen Mary the First. Now, she is unapologetically Catholic. And like she is crazy Catholic. And I'm not trying to say that people who are Catholic are crazy. I'm saying she was crazy. And then she happened to be Catholic. Like she was like not just six sandwiches short of a picnic. She was all sandwiches short of a picnic. I don't think she could help it though. But she changed the country back to Catholicism. And she will kill so many Protestants during this time that they will give her the name Bloody Mary. So there you go. There is one of your urban legends. That's where the name comes from. She will also take this like this mindset that her father does about having to have an heir to the throne. She will be fanatical about it. She marries a cousin from Spain, Philip II, and she will just have this fanatical need to have this heir to the point where she imagines herself pregnant. Now, a lot of historians think that either she had like there is such a thing called like a hysterical pregnancy where women can imagine themselves pregnant, but they do think that she possibly had like cervical cancer or a tumor around her ovaries that caused her stomach to swell, and she imagined herself pregnant, and she really wasn't. But she will die without an heir to the throne, and then that goes to her sister, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, from all accounts, she doesn't really seem to be fanatical about a religion, but she knows that the country really wants to be Protestant. So she's like, okay, we'll be Protestant. I'm not overly concerned with that. I mean, from all my readings, like she's Protestant, but she doesn't seem fanatical about it. And so she's like, okay, we'll be Protestant. We're good with that. But here's what I'm talking about. I want to talk to you about the differences between like the Church of England and then Catholic Church. Okay. So England's Reformation was political and not religious. And if you look at these two churches, you don't see a difference in them. They look the same. And in Henry's mind, he was always Catholic. He never changed. He was always Catholic. He wasn't Church of England. He remained a Catholic. But if you go, and we'll take a look at it in class, if you look at an Anglican church service, the beginning of it, versus a Catholic church service, there's not a huge amount of difference. So what is the difference between the two services? They look almost identical. I mean, they have a lot of the same liturgies. The priest looks similar. The churches look similar. The head of the Catholic Church is the Pope. The head of the Church of England is the King or Queen of England. The only reason that Henry decided to leave the Catholic Church is because he wanted to marry another woman. It had nothing to do with religion. He wasn't mad at the Catholic Church because of indulgences. He wasn't mad at the Catholic Church because he couldn't read the Bible. He didn't care. He wasn't mad at the Catholic Church because of the taxes they were collecting. He wasn't mad at the Catholic Church because of anything that the priests were doing. He just wanted to marry another woman. That was it. It was political. But here's what he did do. He took all of that land. He was so mad at the Pope. He told the Pope, he said, if you don't let me marry Anne Boleyn, I'm going to take all of that land that you own. I'm going to give it to all of the people who support me. And the Pope said, no, you won't. And Henry said, watch me. So to get it passed, to get that act of supremacy passed in 1534, Henry said, tell you what I'm going to do. All of that land. You remember that big old house I showed you at the beginning of this PowerPoint? All of that land, all of those castles that the monks own. Guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to take it away from the church and I'm going to give it to every one of you who votes for this. I'm going to give it every one of you who supports me in this. I'm going to give it every one of you who says, yes, that we will support breaking away from the Catholic Church and making the Church of England and voting that I can divorce Catherine and marry Anne. Well, yeah, who's not going to do that? That's money in their pocket. That's houses in their pocket. And that's why that if you go to all of these big castles in England, half of them, more than half of them, the main houses used to be churches or abbeys or convents or whatever of the Catholic Church. And you can see them. You can see the churches. You can see where they were churches. They were part of the Catholic Church. So, and the Pope could do nothing about it at that point because they had voted them out. So England's Reformation had nothing to do with religion. Absolutely nothing. Henry didn't care. Henry could care less about any of that. He just wanted to get married again. That's all he wanted to do. So the denominations of the world, this is what I was talking about, that before all of that happened, we just had Christians. We didn't care if anybody was Baptist or Methodist or when you went out in your village every week, you went to a church. You didn't nobody went to this church and that church and that church. You just went to church. But this is where it broke apart, and you can kind of see like where the divisions were and how it started, and you can kind of take a look at where your church is and see where you came from, and you can look into that and see the start of that if you want to. Okay. All right. So I hope you watched it. And if you have any questions, and we'll talk about it more in class. And we'll see you one day next week.